Welcome back to Prime and Load. I'm Alex Burns. Today, in addition to Lee and Andrew, we have on Jim Hollister and Jared Fuoss, who are park rangers and historic weapons supervisors at Minuteman National Historic Park in Massachusetts. They're going to tell us a little bit about their expertise on the events of April 19th, 1775, the battles of Lexington and Concord. Great to have you guys on the podcast. Absolutely. So, just before we get on into the events of April 19th, obviously it's a big year for the National Park Service. A lot of work that you all are doing up at Minuteman. What all do you have left to do before the 19th gets here? Maybe that's a stressful question. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
It's great to be here.
I say too much. Well, one of the things that we've, put it to you this way, we've completed the first phase of registration for 750 reenactors. And because this event is so complex and is really kind of pushing the boundaries of what we typically do in the National Park Service, we're well within director's orders, but, again, it is much more complex than what we usually do. So we need to make sure that the reenactors we have are top-notch and have a professional approach. So we have a very extensive vetting process. So they all have to meet, some very basic authenticity standards, which actually what I've found, units that really focus on material culture and those small details also pay attention to drill and to safety. And so we have, they have to meet the authenticity standards. They have to provide, if we haven't worked with them in the past, they have to provide references, which we do check. So we've completed the first phase of the registration, and they all have to submit photographs, which we then send to the Committee of Standards and Inspections. I think it's just a wonderful 18th century sounding name here in New England. And then we provide feedback, and we send that back to them. And then now what we're working on is they're taking that feedback and making the corrections and sending more photographs that will then just make sure that the committee's feedback was followed.
So it's essentially like a vetting process to ensure that the reenactors who are going to be there for the 250th are as accurate as possible?
Absolutely, yep. And
That's
safe,
great.
because again, we want to know who we're working with and how seriously they take this.
And obviously, you all take it both very seriously. I mean, I've known Jared for a while. We were at school together at WVU. But how did you both come to work for Minuteman NPS?
Well, I've been here for 23 years, it's kind of a long, convoluted story. But I started as a volunteer. Then I was able to get into a seasonal position, and then right place, right time, a permanent position opened up, and the park management liked my work and wanted to see more of it, and so I was able, through a student appointment, get into a permanent position.
I've been in Minuteman for now just over 5 years. Oh, that went quick. So I had gotten degrees from the University of Pittsburgh and West Virginia in history and anthropology and archaeology as well. But I was working as a seasonal park ranger at Gettysburg National Military Park for about 6 years. And I had visited Minuteman, I think it was 2018, 2019, and I had kayaked up the river, and I had stopped at the North Bridge. And I remember saying at the time, if there was another battlefield park I'd want to work at, I think it would be Minuteman. And then, much to my surprise, the next year a position opened up. I applied, and I was very, very lucky to get that position, and I have been now happily employed at Minuteman for the last 5 years. So,
I wonder if just for the benefit of those of us on my side of the water, obviously you're talking about 750 reenactors as if it's just like that. You've clearly got a lot more space to play with than I think a lot of the events that UK reenactors would be familiar with. Could you give us a sense of what the park covers and what's actually preserved there?
Sure. Well, the park is about 1,000 acres. Where we're going to have these the tactical demonstrations. Park doesn't do battle reenactments that involve opposing lines and casualty portrayals, because these are memorial sites, and of course the dead are still interred on the field. But we do tactical demonstrations. This battle particularly works very well for that because it's a running battle along a length of road. So we're going to be doing this on a couple locations in the Battle Road unit of the park, where we have restored sections of the original route that the British column took, retreating from Concord to Boston. So it's all throughout the town of Lincoln and into Lexington, we'll be covering at least a few miles in our tactical demonstrations. But it's a very long park, but it's a very narrow park. They had, of course, a much more open agricultural landscape with woodlots and orchards, stone fences and such, and of course houses and barns. But we're hemmed in. We've got like a modern highway on our southern flank, and we've got housing developments and an Air Force base along the north. So 750 reenactors will fill that space up very, very easily.
Yeah, and I'll also just add that question about our kind of scope that we cover here at Minuteman. So Minuteman National Historic Park is just under about 20 miles outside of the city of Boston, but we have actually 4 units within the park. So like Jim said, we have about 1,000 acres. We have the Battle Road unit, which covers the fighting retreats of the British column on April 19th of 1775 for only about 5 miles of an otherwise 16-plus mile battlefield. But we also have the North Bridge unit, which is famously where the Shot Heard Around the World happens at in Concord. But then we also have the farm of Colonel Barrett, who was commanding militia soldiers on April 19th of 1775. And that was kind of the objective of the British forces that day. Their march was specifically looking for supplies. We'll get into this in a little while, but his farm is one of the primary objectives that they are trying to search. And then we also have another unit in the park that is the Wayside unit, which actually covers 19th century literary history. So we have a lot of stuff that we cover within our park. Like I said, it's about 20 miles outside of Boston.
No, thank you. It sounds an amazing job. I'm very jealous of you both. It's would we have that sort of space over here?
Jared, you kind of got into it a little bit. Do you all want to kind of walk us through maybe the immediate background to April 19th and essentially what the British are trying to achieve as they're going out into the countryside around Boston, sort of who the commanders are on either side?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll actually turn it over to Jim for this one because he has a great depth of knowledge on the political background and the build-up to what got us to war in 1775. I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions that we have here about the American War of Independence is, number one, people were upset about taxes, and number two, that war just happens. And as scholars, we know that's not how it works, right? There's a lot of tension and buildup that gets to these points. So I'll let Jim cover that one.
Sure, yeah, and I'll cover this as briefly as possible. I won't give you the classic 5th grade narrative about first the French and Indian War ended, and then there was the Stamp Act. And I usually kind of start by discussing the immediate aftermath of the Boston Tea Party, because that's when everything, it was basically the actions of people on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean kind of threw gasoline on the fire. So of course, the Boston Tea Party, massive destruction of private property belonging to the East India Company, and that is not going to be well received in London. And everybody around here knew something big was coming. Like, this action is going to have to be, there's going to be a response, and nobody's going to like it. And it really kind of gets into the idea of who speaks for me. The Sons of Liberty tend to be the good guys in most narratives, but there are people who are genuinely nervous about them, even a little afraid of them, because they had a lot of power. But when they did that, of course, now everybody is going to feel the effects of it. And when Parliament responds and people learn about what the response is going to be in the late spring of 1774, so ships are starting to come in May. They're bringing new royal governor, General Thomas Gage, replacing the much maligned and outgoing Governor Thomas Hutchinson. And Gage, when he arrives, he's also bringing with him regular troops, and they begin to arrive, by the hundreds, and then later by the thousands. By the end of the summer, you've got about 4,000 regular soldiers stationed in Boston, in the town proper. They had barracks for soldiers for such an occasion out at Castle William in Boston Harbor, but these soldiers are going to be stationed in the town. And more devastating was the Navy arrives, and on June 1st, they close the port of Boston. And so that's harming the town itself. It's harming farmers out in the countryside who rely on selling surplus produce to fuel the markets in Boston and the ships that are coming in and out. That's where they're being supplied from. So it's really hurting everybody. And then the idea is if they've sent a Navy and an Army to enforce the law, are we really free? Free Englishmen. This was not an independence movement. This was securing their rights as British subjects. And then General Thomas Gage, when he arrives, he is also tasked with implementing several acts from the British Parliament that we in America call the Intolerable Acts. They were coercive acts. And among the most hated of these was the Massachusetts Government Act. And what that did, that was a very broad expansion of executive power through the office of the governor. So he got to control the governor's council and appoint its members. Previously, they served as an upper chamber to the legislature. So they were elected by the legislature, but now they're going to be appointed by the governor and paid through Crown funds. And so they're losing a huge representative voice and a key check on royal power. And you also see that he gets to control the courts. So judges, which used to be appointed by the Great and General Court, the legislature, are now appointed and paid by the Crown. So if you think you've got a lot of, in an ideal world, you've got top-down power coming from the king to the royal governor in the offices that he is allowed to appoint. And then you've got bottom-up power, the people, the towns, the select boards, the representatives, and the Great and General Court. And they meet in the middle, and there's a balance. Well, now the top-down is starting to push. So naturally, that's going to excite a reaction. And when the courts are now presided over by Crown appointees, the Governor's Council has now been renamed the Mandamus Council. And again, they're appointees. People realize they're losing control of their justice system and their legislature. And also in the Massachusetts Government Act, town meetings were affected. I was reading it and rereading it the other day, and it's one of those you can look at it and you kind of go, well, okay, well that part of it may not affect me quite so much, but as you keep reading, there's no getting out of it. It is impacting all levels of society, and town meetings are restricted. You could only have one per year, and the governor would have to approve all the articles on the warrant. So this is really getting into everybody's daily lives, in addition to, of course, the economic hardships of the port being closed and the presence of an army. So resistance out in the countryside was fierce and massive. When people are turning out to protest, we're talking about hundreds, and then as we get towards the late summer and early fall, thousands of people. General Gage, he's tasked with keeping the peace to prevent this from turning into a rebellion. He, like many other people in London, believed that this was just a noisy faction that were causing all the problems. And they kind of came over with that mindset. Okay, we'll show some strength. I mean, one of the benefits of sending the army is that you have that wall of strength around the government. And their belief that they held on to for a long time was that the people were really loyal. They were just being frightened into following along with the Sons of Liberty. And so the presence of an army would encourage them to express their loyalty to the crown and to their normal government. Loyalists at this time were often referred to as friends of government. And of course, it didn't work because that sentiment, while there, was not very widespread. And General Gage also realizes that it's not enough. So as events of the late summer and fall are unfolding, like the powder alarm, when he received intelligence that there were that a lot of the towns that kept their town stocks of powder in a common magazine in Charlestown were removing them. He realized all that was left was the government's powder that was reserved for him. So he sent a couple of companies from the 4th Regiment to retrieve the powder. And then they went further into the country, into Cambridge, and retrieved 2 small pieces of artillery. And that occasioned an alarm. And within 24 hours, several thousand militiamen turned up on Cambridge Common. But they were also spurred on by rumors that the regulars had begun to massacre the citizens of Boston and that the Navy had begun shelling the town. They realized those rumors were false. But what was a really interesting episode in this is that as these militia companies are moving forward towards Cambridge, when they realized that no, violence had not broken out, they still continued on, but many of them lodged their arms in public houses and other safe places before continuing on. So being under arms is a very particular message, and a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are not ready to send that message just yet. So they let their numbers speak for themselves, the power behind that movement. While they were there, they also took advantage of the proximity of some newly appointed members of the governor's council and judges. They intimidated them, drove them out of their homes, threats of violence, forced their resignations. And a lot of them, they never came back to their homes. They were driven out. And this is when General Gage starts writing back to London saying, if you think 10,000 men is sufficient, send me 20,000. If you think 1 million pounds in treasure is sufficient, send 2 million. You'll save blood and treasure in the end. And of course, he was right, absolutely right. But that help is not going to arrive. And it only gets worse. And then by October, General Gage has disbanded the legislature. They were set to meet in early October. He refuses to seat them and administer the oaths. And they decide that they're going to seat themselves in defiance of his orders, and they constitute themselves as a provincial congress, and they begin taking over military preparations, allocating more than 20,000 pounds to procure arms and supplies. They take over the commissioning of officers in the militia, and they begin military preparations in earnest.
What were the specific British objectives on the morning of April 19th? I mean, during the powder alarm, obviously they're trying to maybe seize munitions, seize leadership. What is happening?
So the British forces on the morning of April 19th, specifically, they're looking to stop a war from breaking out. So all of that buildup for the previous year has been really aimed towards this, right? They're trying to dissuade violence from happening. That has almost broken into outright warfare multiple times over the winter of 74 into 75. All this kind of being fed by an informant network that has been set up across Massachusetts. So General Gage has his own spies that are out in the countryside. He's been sending officers disguised, even though everybody knew exactly who they are as soon as they leave Boston. He's been sending these officers out. They're scouting towns. They're looking different roads because they're keeping track of what's going on in the countryside. After that alarm in September of 1774, really an arms race builds up. And both British regular forces in Boston and also now the newly forming provincial military forces, their militia that have been reorganized, they're racing each other to find and secure as many military goods as they possibly can. The militia, by the decree of the Provincial Congress, are intending to build an army of 15,000 men. Now, they style it as an army of observation, that they're there to observe what the regulars are doing in Boston, but they're also intending to use this army at some point, one way or another. But if you're going to have 15,000 men, you're going to need the supplies for those 15,000 men. So not just in arms and ammunition, but also in the tents, in the food, and everything you can possibly imagine that would keep them organized and running. So all throughout the winter, Gage's forces are trying to race the provincials to forts and to different stockpiles and to privately owned stockpiles. And they're trying to secure these things. And for the most part, the provincials are going to win that race. And they're going to set up multiple what they call magazines throughout the colony of Massachusetts, two of the biggest ones being in Concord and also in Worcester. As Jim alluded to, Concord is where the provincial congress is going to be meeting. Worcester is farther out into the countryside. So when Gage sends his spies out in early 1775, actually in March of 1775, he is going to be getting reports back of the different roads that lead to these different towns. And basically he's going to come to the conclusion if he needs to launch a strike force to destroy stockpiles of supplies, it is more efficient and probably a lot faster if he goes to Concord as opposed to going to Worcester, because going to Concord, he can get forces there and back in the course of a single day, whereas in Worcester, it would take multiple days to get forces out there. And if the countryside truly is making themselves and ready for a military clash, then that means that his forces could be out in the countryside for multiple days, cut off from their supply back in Boston. So all of this kind of leads to April of 1775. Gage knows there's these large stockpiles that are being accumulated. In Concord itself, we joke that pretty much every house in Concord is filled with military goods. I mean, you have tons and tons of food, tents, entrenching tools. On top of that, you also have barrels of gunpowder. You have barrels of musket balls. You have a few small arms. You have medical supplies. But then on top of all of that, what Gage is really looking for is artillery. Huge stockpiles of artillery that are being shuffled around the countryside over the past few months. And Gage has actually been chasing some of those artillery pieces. In fact, 4 of those pieces had slipped out from under the noses of British soldiers in Boston the previous September, right after the powder alarm happened. The Boston train of artillery, which was a militia artillery train in Boston, Gage had locked down the 4 guns that they had there, only to discover that provincials in the dead of night on 2 different nights had snuck into the gun houses and dismounted the barrels and carried them out without anybody realizing. So those guns had been moved into the countryside. Gage is looking to get those back, but he's also chasing cannon he'd heard about in Salem in February of 1775. Unsuccessfully, he sends men to Salem. They're turned back without finding really anything. So Gage has word that those cannons are in Concord. And he also has word that some of those cannons, some of those brass cannon, like the ones that were stolen in September the previous year, were at the farm of Militia Colonel James Barrett. So Gage is kind of drafting up this plan. He knows he's going to have to act. He's going to have to act soon. He's getting pressure from London that are saying, do something about this rebellion that is forming. And really London is telling him, you know, you have sufficient troops. All you need to do is demonstrate force, and they will buckle to that force. And Gage is writing back, as Jim alluded to, saying, you don't truly understand the severity of the situation we are in here. But he's getting pressure. He knows his window of opportunity is slipping away. So ultimately, he is going to launch this, what he thinks is going to be a secret expedition. He's going to send 800 hand-selected soldiers from Boston out to Concord on a mission to find and destroy those stockpiles of supplies. If everything goes according to plan, those British regular soldiers will leave Boston on the evening of April 18th, 1775. They will arrive in Concord by daybreak on April 19th of 1775. They'll destroy the supplies, turn around, and head back to Boston before anybody knows the better. But with historical hindsight, we know that is not at all how that's going to turn out.
That's fascinating. And so, can you tell us a little bit about like how both sides are practically preparing for battle? I mean, are the, or I guess not preparing for battle because they're trying to prevent a war. Maybe neither side marches to April 19th thinking there's going to be an actual beginning of a war there. But, I mean, as Americans, sometimes we like to emphasize maybe the realistic training and marksmanship that the Americans are doing and compare that to how maybe we think the British Army fights. How are both sides actually preparing for this?
Sure, I'll cover this one. So so the militia by law train 4 days every year, and then 2 additional days for instruction and inspection. That's going to ramp up. We have a really interesting anecdote that appeared in the Boston Gazette in early September of 1774. And this is in the midst of, like, the powder alarm, the court closures where thousands of people are turning out to force the closures of the court, all of this stuff. There was a militia captain, Jonas Minot, in Concord, who commanded a militia company. And he said that the other officers in his town and his regiment were warning their men to, ordering their men to meet under arms weekly and warning them to be ready at a moment's notice. And he was uncertain, like, this feels a little treasonous to me. And he went to speak with General Brattle in Cambridge, who was a loyalist. And Brattle, and he mentioned it to him. He said, "What do you think about this?" And Brattle said, "Don't do it. You're going to get in a lot of hot water." And then Brattle quickly turned around and wrote a letter to Gage. And then that letter somehow got dropped in the town and picked up and published in the newspaper. So, oops. And so Jonas Minot had to write an apology and explain just what the heck he was doing. But you start to see that language of ready at a minute's notice starting to appear. It's mentioned in a lot of the county conventions about having their militia ready, increasing the training beyond the minimum required by law. And then the provincial Congress sort of embraces this and recommends they form Minuteman companies, and they're training 2 or 3 times a week. And they're actually using the same manual as the British Army. They adopted, instead of the Norfolk Extract, which they've been using since the 1760s, which was a simplified militia drill, they adopt the 1764 manual exercise, and they said it was best suited for appearance and defense. So a more effective and efficient manual that was in use by the regular army. So they are, if you think as reenactors, if we practice, if we train, maybe, a few times a year or a month during the campaign season, we're looking pretty good. But, for these minute companies training, 2 or 3 times a week, 4 hours at a time, going through these evolutions, they're going to look pretty good. And you do see on the 19th of April, British officers seeing them march down to the North Bridge, saying they marched down upon us in a very military manner. They were drawn up with the greatest regularity. On the British side of things, of course, this is a peacetime army, garrisoned in Boston. And as with many peacetime armies, and of course the army itself is just as a general condition, these regiments are dispersed on different stations. So to get a concentration like you see in J. Holden's book, Fit for Service, you see, it's rare to get these concentrations where you can train at those battalion levels or higher. But General Gage, once he has his army assembled in Boston, does just that. So he's knowing that some kind of service, some kind of active service is imminent. So he's trying to put a keener edge on them. And so they're increasing their training. They're actually practicing firing at marks, at targets out in Boston Harbor. I hear that all the time from visitors, that the muskets were ineffective. They were, you couldn't hit the broadside of a barn, and the British were just told to present and not to aim. That's completely false, as you well know. And in the manual, it says to, close your left eye and take good sight. So they're practicing firing at marks. Now, very specifically, the light infantry. So none of the regiments in Boston had their light infantry companies that were at that big training camp. Was it Salisbury? They weren't there. But they're light infantry companies. Howe has been out with his treatise for a while, and Townsend's. So Gage is going to engage, of course, being a strong proponent of the light infantry, is going to make sure that they're going to get that light infantry training. And there's a really excellent account by a traveler through the countryside. He was a physician from Scotland. His name is Dr. Robert Honeyman. And he was in Boston in that late winter of 1775. And he published his memoirs in something called Colonial Panorama. But he mentions in Boston, he said, and I'll quote it here, "Every regiment here has a company of light infantry, young, active fellows, and they are trained in the regular manner, and likewise in a peculiar discipline of irregular and bush fighting. They run out in parties on the wings of the regiment where they keep up a constant and irregular fire. They secure their retreat and defend their front while they are forming. In one part of the exercise, they lie on their backs and charge their pieces and fire lying on their bellies. They have powder horns and no cartouche boxes. So you see, like, they're going to tree. They're taking advantage of cover. They're understanding that, this is warfare in North America, and this is something that General Gage himself had a lot of experience in. So they are fairly well prepared for the coming campaign, whatever it's going to be. So anyway, so they're getting that keener edge on them, and with live ammunition, light infantry exercises and such.
That's so fascinating, because all the people I constantly waste my time with fighting in YouTube comment sections tell me that you can't load a musket lying down. So clearly this primary source is wrong. Thank you so much, Jim. That was incredible. As Americans, I generally think that the average student that I have at Franciscan University is probably thinking about the Revolutionary War a little bit less in real life than they are in my mind. But when Americans think about the events of April 19th, they usually picture the showdown on Lexington Green. And so what 300 or so British soldiers show up on the green facing off against 70 odd Americans, if I've got the figures right. What goes down in this maybe first clash of what will become the Revolutionary War?
So this is where we start really getting into the bread and the butter of what we do here at Minuteman, and I often joke that a lot of it is busting myths about what we think we know about the revolution and what actually happened on April 19th. And the unfortunate answer is a lot of times we don't know what actually happened. And the Lexington Green is one of those great examples. So we got to roll back a little bit, though, of what actually gets us to the Lexington Green that morning, because that provides context of what's going to happen next at about sunrise that day. And that is, so we know that General Gage is going to select special soldiers that he is going to send out to Concord on the evening of April 18th, headed to find and destroy those supplies. So he's going to select between 700 and 800 regular soldiers, primarily from those flank companies, so grenadiers and light infantry soldiers. Most of these men, as Jim alluded to earlier, have never really had the opportunity to work together specifically before. So this is kind of a new kind of amalgamated command that Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith of the 10th Regiment of Foot is going to lead up. And the objective that they are going to march out of Boston unseen, unheard, as we know, that is not at all how this goes, because those soldiers are going to start being dispersed from their encampment on the Boston Common at about 10 p.m. on the evening of April 18th. And they're going to be sent down to the local docks right along what is the Charles River, because at that time period, Boston was a peninsula. And the only way to get in and out of Boston was over the very narrow Boston Neck. And that neck has British fortifications and things on it. However, if you go out the Boston Neck, hypothetically, it's going to take a lot longer to go down around the neck, and there's a lot more time for people to see and to realize what is going on. So small pockets of British soldiers are going to be taken down to the docks. They're going to load into boats, and then they're going to be rowed across the Charles River and deposited on the other side in kind of a marshy flat up against the river, where they'll have to wade through water, sometimes up to their waist, to get onto dry land in 36-degree weather in the middle of the night under a full moon. So not the most pleasant of experiences for these regular soldiers. But again, they're doing this because they want to try and keep that secrecy. However, we know that's not how it goes, because Dr. Joseph Warren from Boston has this kind of network of spies and informants that are watching, a network of mechanics is what they called them. Paul Revere, the famous Paul Revere, being one of many people who are keeping tabs on the British regulars. And the previous evening, they had noticed, some weird things are going on. Early in the afternoon on the evening of April 18th, a detachment of British officers will actually be sent out of Boston, and their objective is to go into the countryside along the Bay Road, which is the main highway that connects Boston to Concord, and they're going to set up checkpoints of British officers. And the objective being is that if the alarm goes out, those British officers will capture the alarm riders that could be spreading this information. So at about 6 p.m. the previous evening, a detachment of British officers goes riding through downtown Lexington. And that immediately raises some eyebrows, right? So the whole town starts saying, something weird's going on. They're not typically out this far, especially mounted officers. So they call out the militia at 6 p.m. the previous evening, and they determine, well, we don't know exactly what's going on, so they send some men to follow those British officers. Just so happens that those men don't come back to rejoin the Lexington militia because they get down the road a little ways, they get into what is now the town of Lincoln, and they are captured by those British officers, and they're held at gunpoint in a small pasture. So all throughout the night, news is already starting to trickle out of Boston that something is going on. So when the British regulars start deploying across the river and they're getting set up, it's going to take hours for them to do that, to move 700 to 800 men across the Charles River in small boats and deposit them. And then they wait for a different supply of food to be issued, rations to be issued to the men. It takes a very long time. So they don't actually start moving their column until about 2 o'clock in the morning. And that has given plenty of time for men like Paul Revere and William Dawes to be dispatched out of Boston. Revere's famous 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, the signal on the North Church, that is designating what route the regular army is taking out of Boston. So obviously 2 lanterns because they're going over the Charles River. And Revere is actually the one that sets those lanterns. That's not a signal to him. He's signaling out in case he doesn't get across the Charles River, which he does. He gets mounted on the horse. He starts riding out into the countryside, alarming everybody that the regulars are out. Not that the British are coming. They're all British at this point, right? We know this. The regulars are out, but he's almost captured. Just leaving Charlestown, he averts being captured by a British patrol and then makes his way circumnavigationally back to the Bay Road and headed towards Lexington. The same time, William Dawes is dispatched down the Boston Neck, and he also gets out of Boston miraculously, and they start activating this alarm network that is now spreading across Massachusetts, and by morning will even be encroaching on the borders of Massachusetts into neighboring colonies. So it's a very effective network of alarm. But Revere and Dawes are headed to Lexington, primarily, because they're there to warn members of the provincial Congress that the regulars are marching out. They think that it's possible the regulars are coming to arrest some of these men. In reality, Gage never orders for the arrest of those men. He's primarily looking to destroy those supplies in Concord. So Revere and Dawes arrive in Lexington about midnight, which alarms the town. They start moving some of these important men out of the area. The Lexington militia, note that we call them militia. They're not Minutemen because they didn't raise minute companies in Lexington, because that would have required paying those minute companies a little bit more than they were willing to do so. But these militia companies are going to form, and then they start having the age-old debate, is this real? Do we know this is actually happening? And that debate's happening in every town across Massachusetts. Is this really going to go down? So Lexington stands around for a little bit. They're not quite sure it's going. They're dispersed briefly to go, if they live a distance, to go into Buckman Tavern there on the green to hang around close by. If they live nearby the green, they can go home for a little bit of time, but to be recalled if they are needed, right? Meanwhile, the British Army, their column, has started marching down the Bay Road, and they are very shortly out of the vicinity of where they had started marching when they start hearing church bells ringing and gunfire in the distance, and they start to realize, that's not right. I compare this to our modern audiences of, when the phone goes off at 2 o'clock in the morning, that's probably not good news, right? And that is exactly what the regulars are realizing. They're hearing the countryside waking up that morning. So they realize very quickly, we are not going to get to Concord before everybody knows where we're going. So they start sending messages. Lieutenant Colonel Smith starts sending messages back to Boston saying, please send us reinforcements. We are going to need additional support if we are going to get to Concord and back. So we'll get to that portion of the story a little bit later, but Gage continues his march down the road towards Lexington, now hours behind schedule, and as they're encroaching on the town of Lexington, they notice a body of troops in front of them moving at some distance, and some of his mounted officers with his column will actually ride forward, and in that process they end up capturing some locals who are moving on the road, and those locals say, you know that there are thousands of men down the road awaiting you, right? So this kind of alarms Gage, and he knows that time is of the essence. This alarms Lieutenant Colonel Smith. He knows that time is of the essence. So he decides to break his column. He's going to split the light infantry soldiers and send them ahead, rushing front of the rest of the British column, the grenadiers behind, along with some artillerists who have been brought out to destroy any cannons. And those light infantry, their objective is to rush to the town of Concord and secure the important bridgeheads in the town of Concord. But they don't go very far. It's only a few hundred men, just over 300 men of those light infantry soldiers that are going to go just about a mile down the road. They stop just before they enter into the town of Lexington, supposedly because a local Lexington militia soldier jumped out of the bushes and snapped his piece at one of the officers, and there was only a flash in the pan. Now, whether or not that happened, that's one of those things that's kind of a little bit up for debate. But the British soldiers stop and they load their weapons, and then they continue on. And they don't go again very far before they enter into the Lexington green space. And as they're entering into the town of Lexington, there they see kind of a diffused mass of militia soldiers that are now starting to gather on the Lexington green. There are about 77 men from John Parker's company of Lexington Militia that are being recalled back to the green itself. And all the accounts you read from the time period, it's a very chaotic scene. It's not like you see in movies or in the famous April morning scene where you hear the British drums beating long before you see the column. This is chaos, and it happens very quickly. You have militia soldiers that are starting to form up on the green. You have men that are marching or walking out of Buckman Tavern just beside the green after pulling ammunition. You have other men that are on the outskirts of the green, along with some families that are now starting to gather, watching what's happening. And the accounts that we have basically say that the head of the British light infantry column encroaches on the green. They're not going to just march past this obvious threat that is being posed by these militia soldiers, because that, number one, could spell trouble for them, but it's also potentially going to spell trouble for the grenadiers that are marching up the road shortly behind. So the accounts that we have say that mounted officers in the British column ride forward, and they're demanding that the militia disperse, to go home, disperse to leave. And it's in that kind of exchange that there are a few other things going on at the same time. First of all, the first company of light infantry behind those British officers are going to start forming up onto the green. And within this shouting, this chaos, a single gunshot rings out. Now, to this day, we do not know who fired that gunshot. Obviously, the depositions that are taken right afterwards, the regular officers, the regular soldiers said it was the militia soldiers, the country people, they fired at us first. And obviously, if you read the provincial depositions, every one of them says, no, it was the British officers who fired on us first. We don't know who fired that first shot, but we know the result of it, is that first company of light infantry coming onto the green, when that shot rings out, they start firing without orders. And the next company that's coming into this, they pull up onto the green and they start firing without orders. So in very short time, you have two discharges of musketry that rip into this Lexington gaggle that is starting to form on the green. And then those British regular light infantry break. And they start chasing down those militia soldiers, and they're actually chasing them through the town. There's only a handful of men that are killed immediately on the green in this exchange. Many of the others are killed around the green or being chased through the town by these light infantry soldiers. So this happens in a matter of minutes, if not seconds, and it's just pure chaos. When the smoke clears, there's a handful of men killed, a handful of men wounded, but shortly after the exchange of musketry, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith arrives mounted on the green, and he's demanding to know what has happened. He sees chaos, he sees men running around all over the place, and he immediately grabs hold of a drummer, and he says, beat the recall. And he gets these men, he's now trying to rein in his troops. And he's successful in doing that. He gets his men under control, he gets them back and organized on the green, leaving it scattered with dead and wounded militia soldiers. And then he lets his column let out a huzzah for a victory. They fire supposedly an extra volley, and then that is when the British officers, the rest of the column, learn where they're headed. Not to Lexington, but to Concord. So at this point, Smith is going to push on. He can't really turn back at this point. He's going to push on the next 5.5, 6 miles headed towards Concord itself. And as the British column exits the town of Lexington, they will be shortly followed by the first of the militia companies now responding to the alarm. A 3-company detachment from the town of Woburn, commanded by a man named Loamy Baldwin, is going to arrive in the Lexington Green just minutes after the bloodshed there in the Green, and they will be incised to discover all of their dead and wounded countrymen. So they immediately start burying the dead, and then they start marching towards the back of the British column, chasing them towards Concord. They are not the only ones, because now there are thousands of militia soldiers on the move just after daybreak that morning, headed towards Concord.
This is so great. I've got a lot of follow-up questions, but I maybe just want to limit myself to one in the interest of time, and Andrew, Lee, if you guys want more. So I had just read, preparing to lecture a couple days ago, Gage's report from, I think, a couple days after the events, where he relates that anecdote of, a guy on the road snapped his piece. Is that just coming from Gage? Are there other accounts of that incident, or is that basically the one source where we have that story?
Lieutenant William Sutherland mentions it. So yeah, he came out. Okay. He belonged to a battalion company of the 38th, so he came out as a volunteer. So he was out in front with another officer, Lieutenant Jesse Adair of the Marines. Adair was apparently in a one-horse cart called a chaise, and Sutherland was mounted on horseback. And Sutherland mentions this fellow coming out. He said he presented his piece at me and fired, but burnt priming only. And I called to Mr. Adair to take note of that. So it is coming, at least it's coming from Sutherland.
What I'm hearing is the first shot of the American Revolution was potentially a flash in the pan.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm not gonna pull that thread, but I find that very interesting. Lee, Andrew, anything more you all want from Lexington before we
I suppose just one thing I was wondering about. I was having a look at the British regiments and even the ones that had been involved in 7 Years' War, French Indian War. Most of the men had churned over and they hadn't actually been in action before. They were veterans. Smith, I think, was a veteran, but not maybe as many as you'd think. And it then got me wondering how many of the men on the other side, the militia, had actually had any prior service, either in the ranks or in the leadership.
Excellent question. So yeah, I mean the British Army, they had a lot of turnover. Most of the men had been in the Army for maybe 5 to 10 years. So most have not seen any real action. I think one of the more recent was the Carib War. The 38th were down there, but most of them hadn't. Like the 10th Regiment, they were in Canada for a long time. Some of the regiments, were being sent over from Ireland and such, but they, so it's, again, not a lot of real experience in combat. On the militia side, of course, it is a requirement of law to serve, and part of that is not just attending trainings, but you could be called up. And so during the last French War, there were about, I think something like 15,000 enlistments from Massachusetts Bay alone. That doesn't mean 15,000 men, but because some men enlisted multiple times. And then, of course, there were some men who served in 1745 with the reduction of Fortress Louisbourg and Cape Breton. So there were people, some older men who had some real experience that had seen action before. And of course, in a provincial regiment serving alongside of regular forces like they did during the last French War, a lot of times they're being relegated to garrison duty or building roads. But they did see some real service. So they had more of that experience. And you see in how they're approaching this, you see that experience in action. They know how to raise troops and provision them, how to organize their county regiments and such. There's a great quote from the historian Fred Anderson, who wrote this book called A People's Army. And it's the Massachusetts soldiers and citizens in the French and Indian War. And he said that by the middle of the 18th century, the militia was an all-purpose military infrastructure. It was part home guard, draft board, and rear echelon supply network. So all of that experience is being brought to the table in 1775. So, the regular officers looking at them as country people, farmers with pitchforks. One officer said, if I drew my sword half out of the scabbard, they would scatter like, a wind in the grass. And it's like, no, they're ignoring a lot of history. Another thing I'd want to add about Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, who's leading the Concord expedition, 10th Regiment of Foot. He's been in the Army for a long time. He's, closer to the end of his career than the beginning, but he's a trusted officer, and that's why Gage puts him in charge. Unfortunately, there was one account of a British officer from the 4th Regiment Light Infantry Company, Lieutenant John Barker, who was very frustrated with the slow pace of things in Concord, and he referred to Smith as a very fat, heavy man. And that stuck. And so many tour guides and that we hear like, oh yeah, Smith was the wrong man for the job, and he's terrible at it, and he was too slow and too by the book. What Jared mentioned about with Lexington Green, the chaos, and the second in command, Major Pitcairn in the Marines, he's out in front. He was right behind Sutherland and Adair, and so he is trying desperately to bring his men back under some semblance of order. As one put, to stop, I think as Smith said, to stop the further slaughter of those deluded people. He's not having any luck. He's frantically waving his sword and screaming. Nobody's listening to him. Smith is able to restore order, as Jared said, by calling for a drummer and beating to arms. I've talked with a lot of officers. One of the things we do here is staff rides, so military tours. And I remember speaking with a Marine officer who was really struck by that, how the troops were upset, they're scared, they're inexperienced, they're hearing the sounds of alarm, and that all explodes, when they see the Lexington militia. But to be able to pull them back from that brink, and that is something that is very difficult for officers to do today, and that Smith was able to do that, I think, speaks to that level of experience, competency, and why Gage put so much trust in him.
Yeah, I think that point about the mobilization, regime almost in Massachusetts, is a really great one. I was reading over some of John Adams' letters kind of day by day through January, and he's describing the process of mobilization in 75, and he doesn't say, man, I have no frame of reference for this. He says, wow, this reminds me of when the French fleet was on the coast in the 1740s, and we had so many men kind of signing up to sort of volunteer for service. So that's incredible. Yeah, I mean, certainly there's no American army yet, but there's a long-standing 18th century tradition of military service in New England that goes all the way back to 1740s.
And there's also a great account, Ensign de Bernier, who comes out to Concord on a spy mission. He does a couple of missions in the countryside with his colleague, Captain Brown. And at one point, I think they're in Framingham, and they're at a tavern, and they're watching the town militia training on the town common, very close to the tavern. And they thought this was really amusing, and they were out there, and they're going through their evolutions, and they're like, oh, isn't that cute? And, of course, the officers are then giving them a harangue, put them in mind, quoting Caesar and Pompey, and putting them in mind of Louisburg or Cape Breton, saying the regulars must have been, come to grief if not for us, and that they should charge their pieces coolly and receive their fire. And he says, then they came into the tavern and they drank until 9 o'clock and then went home full of pot valor. But you compare that with his account that he writes after the Concord expedition on April 19th. And he's like, oh my God, there couldn't be less than 5,000 of them. They kept the roads lined and a hot fire on us without intermission. This is insane. And it's just changed his tune.
That's so cruel. I've never heard that anecdote before about the militia officers sort of quoting Pompey and Caesar. That's amazing. Do you all want to take us through a little bit, sort of chronologically moving the story forward? What happens when the British get to the Great North Bridge? They're trying to get to Concord. They've got their hearts set on it. Do they get there?
Short answer is yes. So after the engagement on the Lexington Green, if you would like to call it that, because really it's 8 militia soldiers dead, 10 wounded, and possibly 1 British regular slightly wounded, but depending on who you listen to, whether or not that actually happened. Nonetheless, the British column starts marching from Lexington, and again, they're headed towards Concord. Some of their officers, this is the first time they're learning that they are headed towards Concord. And as they start moving up the road, they're pretty much going to be unopposed from leaving Lexington until they arrive into the vicinity of the town of Concord. However, during that time period, as you can imagine, there's a lot of things going on across the countryside. We already talked about the companies from Woburn that have just arrived in Lexington. They've seen the dead and the wounded, and now they're pursuing the British column. In Concord, though, throughout the course of the morning, they had also been playing that conversation of, is this real? Are they actually headed out in this direction? And to ascertain this information, they have been sending out mounted riders, one of them being a local saddle maker named Reuben Brown from the town of Concord, who will be dispatched by Colonel James Barrett, who is kind of leading up the militia in the town of Concord. It's his farm that has those cannons supposedly stored on it. That morning, when they had gotten the alarm, Barrett knew most of the supplies in Concord had already been removed. The days and the weeks leading up to this, they had expected that the regulars might make a move like this. So they had started moving most of those goods further out west into the countryside. There are still some supplies in Concord, some of the heavier 24-pounder guns that are still in downtown Concord, a few barrels and kegs of things on Barrett's farm. So Barrett, when he takes control, is going to start directing multiple things. He's going to start directing already selected men with carts to meet at his house and start moving the last of the supplies out of his house in his farm. He's also going to start forming the militia that are now starting to arrive in downtown Concord. That's mostly going to be under the command of a man named Major John Buttrick, whose house is just above the North Bridge, actually, overlooking it. And Buttrick is going to start organizing his men. They're going to start pulling ammunition. And then they're also going to start sending those scouts, Reuben Brown being one of them, down the road towards Lexington. And a few hours later, Brown comes spurring back up the road into Concord, reporting gunfire in Lexington. And the first questions will be asked of him supposedly were, are they firing ball? Right? They're trying to ascertain, okay, if there is gunfire being exchanged, are they firing live rounds? Are they killing people? And the answer is, I don't know, because Reuben Brown had arrived on the outskirts of the town of Lexington, heard the gunfire, and immediately turned around and spurred back towards Concord. I don't blame him for that. But this still leaves a little bit of a question there, right? Are they firing blank rounds, which they had hypothesized the regulars might do to disperse men, or are they firing live rounds? So there's still this little bit of, we don't know exactly what's going on, but we will start organizing nonetheless. And as that morning is progressing, now more companies of militia are starting to arrive from the immediately adjacent towns. Companies from the town of Lincoln that is in between Lexington and Concord, that makes up the majority of our Battle Road unit of our park today. Companies from Lincoln will arrive in Concord. Companies from Bedford will arrive in Concord. And Major Buttrick is going to start organizing those men. They'll start having kind of a little council of war of what do we do at this point. Some of those men will actually split up, some of them going onto a nearby hilltop above the town meeting house. Some of them will be down in the center of downtown. And before long, there's a decision made that some of them are going to advance out of the town of Concord, and they're going to move towards Lexington, but they're going to stay on a ridge line, this high ridge that runs along the Bay Road leading into the town of Concord. And from that ridge line, hopefully, they will be able to see the approach of the regular soldiers. And just in the morning sunlight, they are going to exactly witness that. They talk about the glistening of the bayonets of the British column as it's now encroaching on the town of Concord about a mile and a half away, as those soldiers descend what is called Brooks Hill, and they can see the bayonets glistening and their bright uniforms in the sunlight. And it's that moment they realize, oh yes, they are in fact coming, and this could get ugly. So as the regulars start to advance, they too are seeing those militia soldiers. So Smith is going to do exactly what he's been trained to do. He's going to deploy his flankers. He's going to deploy screens to move those militia out and away from that high ground. He's going to send his light infantry soldiers ahead of the British column as a vanguard that are trying to push those militia off the tops of the ridge lines. And it's not that difficult because the militia will willingly leave those ridge lines, because at this point they only have about 200 men, and they're looking at the column that we know is between 700 and 800, but for them it could be 1,000 for all they know. Is a very long column marching by column of platoons down the road, so they look impressive. The militia then retreat. They're bouncing from hillside to hillside back towards the town of Concord, being pursued very closely by light infantry flankers. And even one of the militia soldiers will recall marching in the road leading into Concord ahead of the British column, and he said that the musicians were playing together. He said they had a grand music as they marched into downtown Concord. And as the militia withdraw, again, they're unsure of what's going on. They don't necessarily want to precipitate conflict, bloodshed, so they withdraw back through the town and ultimately decide to go over Concord's North Bridge. And they're going to go over the North Bridge and to withdraw further into the countryside to another hill rise about a mile away from the North Bridge. And while this is going on, the militia soldiers from the surrounding towns are going to start joining them there. Meanwhile, the regulars are in downtown Concord, now starting to form up and disperse on their missions that they have been assigned. So you're going to see some grenadiers that are going to be sent to Concord's South Bridge. You have two bridges in Concord, the South Bridge and the North Bridge, aptly named. The South Bridge will have some grenadiers protecting that. You'll have grenadiers that are now being sent to search the buildings in the town of Concord, looking for those supplies. But then you'll also have about 120 men, primarily those light infantry companies, that will be sent over Concord's North Bridge, and they are headed for the farm of Colonel James Barrett, because again, they think that that's where the bulk of the supplies and the cannons might be stored at. So they're going to leave, though, about 96 men to guard the North Bridge itself. 96 men who will fan out across the area around the bridge on the hillside, protecting the road and the important bridge crossing, and they're going to take 120 additional men out to Barrett's farm to find the supplies. As all that's going on, the militia soldiers from the safety of what they refer to as Punkatasset Hill are watching these British soldiers, but they're quite a distance, so they can't quite see what's going on. They can see them maneuvering, they can see them in the downtown Concord area, and as their numbers continue to grow, so does their boldness. They're going to decide, we want a little bit of a better view. So the militia decide to advance, and this time they're going to advance from Punkatasset Hill to another ridgeline that's just overlooking the North Bridge, a couple hundred yards away. And as they do so, those British light infantry soldiers, primarily from the 10th Regiment of Foot and the 4th Regiment of Foot, they view this almost as an attack, because those two companies are the same two companies that were on the Lexington Green that morning. They have already been through combat that day. So as they see this massive formation of militia coming towards them, they're going to start withdrawing. The 10th Regiment of Foot first will come down what is the original causeway we still have in our park today, followed shortly behind by the 4th. They're going to hold on to that important river crossing as long as they can, but eventually they're going to have to abandon the road that leads out to Barrett's farm, because the militia will encroach onto that hill rise overlooking the bridge and the area itself. And it's during this time period that some of the other British officers are now writing messages back to Smith in downtown Concord saying, we need reinforcements, we need reserves to come out to the bridge, they're advancing upon us. And this tense kind of stalemate is going on at this point. You have militia soldiers just a few hundred yards away staring down at these British regulars because the hill overlooking the bridge is quite high. You have British regulars who are withdrawing down a very narrow causeway that crosses over the bridge because the area around the causeway is flooded in April of 1775. It is not traversable. So anybody who is going to cross that bridge has to cross over the bridge and the very narrow causeway going either direction. So as the militia are looking down at them, they're also going to start having their council of war again. They have officers from various towns that are now starting to step forward, and they're debating, what do we do next? Because they can really see what's going on in downtown Concord. And before long, those militia start to see a plume of smoke coming from the center of downtown Concord. Now, if you're a militia soldier whose entire directive, your entire existence is based off of protecting your town, your family, That doesn't look good. So a debate is going to be had. Supposedly one of the Concord's militiamen will step forward and he'll say something along the lines of, I have heard it often said that the regulars can march through our countryside and burn our towns and our hamlets. I start to believe this is true. Will you just stand here and let them burn the town? And of course the answer is no. So at this point in time, Colonel James Barrett is on the scene. Major John Buttrick is on the scene from the town of Concord. You have companies that are arriving from towns like Acton that are now starting to arrive. You have some men from Westford that are starting to arrive. So all these towns are starting to gather. There are about 400 militia soldiers now on the rise of ground overlooking the bridge. And remember, there are only 96 British regulars. So the tables have turned at this point. And those regulars are looking up at those militia soldiers, and they're having the response that you would imagine that they're having is a big old uh-oh. Because before long, they see that militia column starts moving towards them. The column is going to snake down and around through this pasture land owned by one of the Concord Minutemen captains, Captain David Brown. They're going to move through his cow pasture onto the Causeway Road, headed down towards the North Bridge. And at the head of that column is a company of militiamen, Minutemen, from the town of Acton, commanded by a young man named Isaac Davis. Now, Davis's men had just arrived there just before the advance towards the North Bridge that morning. But his wife left an account of what had been going on that morning as his men somberly collected at their home, started rolling cartridges. As they were leaving the house, supposedly her husband turned around, looked at her, and left with the words, "Take good care of the children," and was soon out of sight. And now Davis is leading this column down to the North Bridge. And just before those militia had left to head towards the North Bridge, they had been given the order, load your guns. Some of them are going to switch out the flints on their muskets. We know this because we found that archaeologically. In the 1930s, gentlemen surveying the ground up at the top of the muster field, as they still call it, found 2 rows of flints in formation where the men had changed the flints and dropped them at their feet. That moment that they know they are going into combat. They want to make sure their guns are going to go off. And then they're given the order to load their muskets. But then Colonel James Barrett will ride up and down the line giving the explicit order, do not fire unless first fired upon. So imagine that. You're Isaac Davis. You've been told to load your gun, march down this narrow causeway, and let the enemy shoot at you first before you can respond to it, right? So there's Isaac Davis, the acting company. Right beside him is Major John Buttrick. Again, his house is right at the top of the hill overlooking the North Bridge, and they're marching down that long causeway. And those British soldiers at the base of the causeway are starting to panic. They said that they came down in military order, right? These men obviously know what they're doing. This is not these country bumpkins that they have been led to believe that they don't know how they're going to respond. They don't know what's going on. These men know well what they are about. And as that column gets closer and closer, the British soldiers really start to panic. They start withdrawing over the bridge, starting to form up there on the road on the other side of the bridge. One of their officers is going to start telling the men, you should form for street firing formation, which hypothetically, that's a really great formation to oppose any sort of crossing of the river because you can have constant fire being laid down upon your enemy. However, that necessitates that all of your companies under your command know how to do that formation adequately, right? And at the same time, you have other British officers that are ordering men to do different things. Sutherland, that we talked about earlier, is going to call to some of those British regulars to follow him over the side of one of the stone walls out into one of the fields. Some of the men are going to start pulling up planks on the bridge, seemingly forgetting about their 120 comrades that are 2 miles down the road at Barrett's farm, right? But they're trying to do whatever they can to hinder the militia crossing the bridge. But the militia are set on crossing the bridge, going into town, and discerning what is going on. And as they get closer and closer, that tension continues to build. Chaos is reigning on the British side. Order is prevailing on the militia side. And before long, both columns are within about 70, 75 yards of each other. And at that point in time, for the second time that day, British regular soldiers are going to open fire without orders. They're going to take matters into their own hands. It's a few dropping shots from the regular side. We know this because both sides leave depositions and accounts that kind of basically say the same thing. But those first few shots go wide into the river beside the militia. One of the men talked about the zip of the musket balls and the splash of water as the balls went flying past the column. And then the rest of the British soldiers in the road opened fire as well. Except this time, that first platoon isn't firing into the water. They're firing straight into the militia column itself. And now it's not the zip and the splash, it's the zip and the crack of flesh and bone as those musket balls are striking men in the column. And one of the first to fall is Captain Isaac Davis, that had turned to his wife and said, "Take good care of the children." He's shot through the heart and killed instantly. Another man standing behind him is hit in the head. He drops dead. Another handful of men back the column are also hit and wounded in this exchange. And it's at that moment Major John Buttrick turns around and he screams out to the rest of the militia column, "Fire! For God's sake, fellow soldiers, fire!" And that moment right there is definitively what we call the shot heard round the world, right? That's the first time the militia are ordered to fire on their own government's soldiers. And at this point, one of the militiamen said that it was a miracle we didn't kill more of ourselves, right? Because each of these men in this long column, 400 men, they're stretching up and around the bend in the road, are going to start stepping out of rank, and they pour a hail of musketry onto the British regular soldiers on the other side. And then the first sections of that column, particularly the acting companies, are going to go charging over the bridge itself. And when they get to the other side of the bridge, breaking through that cloud of smoke, they discover nothing. The British regulars were not going to stick around to figure out what happens when 400 angry militiamen come charging over a bridge after them, right? They will find that most of that British column has dissolved within that hail of musketry, and they are now running back down the road. They've left 2 men dead or mortally wounded lying at the base of the bridge. A third one is being dragged up the road by his comrades. Within the course of about 30 seconds, 20 men on either side have been killed or wounded in this very brief exchange. The active militia soldiers, some others, will follow the British regulars. They pursue them up to the edge of the town of Concord, where there they will meet reinforcements dispatched by Smith in the town of Concord. And there the British regulars start to form a line of battle. The militia will go up onto a hillside behind a stone wall and take cover from behind it. And they talk about watching the officers of these regulars forming the men as if they were on parade ground. One of the militia soldiers said, "We could have killed every one of them if we wanted to, but we didn't." There's another tense moment that prevails, because it's probably from this point that the militia can see the town is not burning. It turns out the regulars had discovered some supplies, particularly carriages, artillery carriages, that they've heaped up in the middle of town. They lit them on fire. And that fire jumps to one of the townhouses in downtown Concord, and an older woman named Martha Moulton would start berating some of the British officers in downtown Concord, telling them, "You better put that fire out." And at first they dismissed her, but then they listened to her, and they start putting out the fire that had been growing in the town, and that creates this big plume of smoke. And that's what the militia had seen on the top of the hill rise from outside of town. But from the hill closest to the town, now they can see town is not burning. But if they continue pressing this attack, that may not necessarily stay that way. So this very tense moment encounter between these regular reinforcements and these militia soldiers will come to pass with no additional bloodshed. The militia will decide to withdraw. Some of them will go back over the North Bridge. They'll go right back to the top of the hill where they had started from. And then they really start having the discussion of, what have we just done? And a few moments later, all those soldiers that had been out at Colonel Barrett's farm, those British regular soldiers, return empty-handed. They had found pretty much nothing at Barrett's farm except for Barrett's wife, Rebecca, giving them a scolding for coming out there. Those British soldiers return back into downtown Concord, and as they cross over the North Bridge, what they find are their 2 dead comrades lying at the base of the bridge. One of those men had been struck in the head with a hatchet by a militia soldier as they were crossing over the bridge. So those regulars go into downtown, and they start telling all the other British soldiers in downtown they're scalping the wounded. They're taking no quarter on the men who are left behind. And that starts to set the mindset of the next phase of the battle, right? But they're going to have to hang out in downtown Concord for an additional 2 hours after the fight at the North Bridge, because they're hoping their reinforcements that they sent back for earlier that morning in Boston are coming out to meet them. But they are not as of this point.
I guess if I'm listening to this story again and again, I'm hearing the power of rumor in the 18th century. The Americans hearing, all the way back in during the Powder Alarm, are they massacring the people in Boston? The British are coming back from Barrett's Farm and thinking, oh man, they're scalping the wounded. And I mean, this is something you see again and again across 18th century armies. Some, and I'm going to be very rude here, but some idiot in the ranks is like, I heard an order that we weren't supposed to give any quarter. And so, there's the massacre as a result. I mean, this happens with the Prussians and the Saxons at Striga, Hohenfriedeburg. And so, yeah, I think that's what's really striking out to me about this. But so the British are back in Concord. They didn't find what they were hoping to find, except for maybe those artillery carriages that are torched.
Right. What they burned the artillery carriages. They did find some 24-pound guns in the yard of the jail. They disabled them. They knocked the trunnions off of them. But they didn't find the brass artillery. They didn't find, the barrels of gunpowder. They did find some casks of flour, and they threw them into the mill pond. But as later historians would write, the casks leaked, and the wood swelled and sealed it, and so they were able to recover most of the flour. So really, in terms of their objectives, it was a complete disaster. They came out to seize and destroy arms and ammunition, to disrupt the colonial military preparations, prevent a war that's now started one. And all the while, like in those awkward 2 hours between the fight at the bridge at around 9:30 in the morning to when they evacuate around noon, Smith is having to secure his wounded and regroup. And one of he gets really lucky because he's got Captain Lawrence Parsons of the 10th Regiment out at Barrett's Farm, who, when Captain Laurie defending the bridge is driven off, and so now the bridge is in colonial hands. Technically, Parsons' force is cut off. However, the colonials don't hold the bridge. They disperse. And so Parsons is able to recross, and so he rejoins. So Smith got really lucky at that point. And again, I think as Jared mentioned, he was hoping his reinforcements. So this is speculation, but one of the theories as to why he delays in Concord so long is because he's expecting those reinforcements. But their orders were delayed, and they were still in Boston. They didn't leave Boston until almost between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning. So it's going to take a little while. So really, he's got to go because time is not on his side. With that open agricultural landscape, in the hills in Concord, he can look out and he can see militia troops on the way. One of the Doolittle engravings that was done showing the British entering Concord shows Smith and Pitcairn on a hill, in the burying ground, surveying colonial positions. So, of course, they know that the countryside is mobilized. So, around noon, they begin to leave. And obviously, now the situation is different. They know that they're going to be most likely going to encounter resistance, and that this is going to be hotly contested. So I'm going to quote de Bernier again. He said, "We began our march to return to Boston about 12 o'clock in the day in the same order of march, only our flankers were more numerous and further from the main body." So when we were doing the Parker's Revenge archaeology investigation several years ago, when we were doing the analysis, okay, what are we looking at? And the dispersal of the musket balls and such on the ground. And so I was doing a little bit of digging to help with the analysis. So, if you go back to Humphrey Bland, his treatise of military discipline, there's a whole chapter, how to march a regiment of infantry through a close and broken country where there's a possibility of being attacked by the enemy. Just rolls off the tongue. And of course, there's a lot of evidence in these firsthand accounts from the British regulars that is still being followed. First, as Jared mentioned, that they're marching in platoon fronts, which is right out of Bland. but also, more flankers out. They're divided into roughly 3 divisions: a vanguard, a main body, and a rear guard. And the flankers, again, more numerous further out. They're able to cover more of the length of the column, which is extending for, about a quarter to a third of a mile. And that's going to take time to cross any given point. So, they put themselves back in order, they reinforce their flankers, and they begin marching down the Lexington Road back towards Lexington, leaving Concord. And on the north side of the road, there was a ridge that ran from Miriam's Corner all the way into the center of town. So they've got flankers on that height of ground. And then they get their other flank south of the road in the fields. But they're going to march out of town, and they're going to get to a place called Miriam's Corner, about a mile and a half east of the town center. And coming down the Old Bedford Road from the north are companies from Reading, and they see the flank guard. And they at first mistook them for Charlestown militia. I'd love to know more about what Charlestown militia were wearing at the time, being into material culture, but they mistake them for Charlestown militia and then realize, nope, they're British regulars, and they get ready for action. But once you get to Miriam's Corner, this is where things start to go wrong. So I'm going to turn things over to Jared at this point.
I'll pause for a second. Does anybody have any questions about kind of the tactical retreat the regulars are using?
In terms of platoons, it sounds very, very much what Steuben will want us to do when he comes over in 1778. I mean, yeah, sounds like very standard 18th century military practice.
And like we were talking about earlier, a lot of our job is myth busting, right? Taking that idea of the rigid British regular soldier who is locked into the road and can't do anything but march down the road and get shot at, right? Which we, again, have ample evidence that is not the case whatsoever. So as the British column is now exiting the town of Concord, right, they're leaving behind kind of the safety of the coverage of that town in multiple ways, right? They have control of the town, and now they're moving into an open agricultural landscape that they're not necessarily able to threaten anymore, right? There's nothing that is keeping the militia back and away from them. And as we talked about, there are all these thousands of militia that are now converging on Concord on the Bay Road. And the fight on the way back to Boston is really the bulk of the battle on April 19th. So you often hear the battles of Lexington and Concord. Well, the battles of Lexington and Concord, as many people think of, both take about 2 minutes each, right? The real story is what comes next for the rest of the day. And I like to say it is the battle of Lexington and Concord, because these aren't all disassociated elements of a fight, right? They all flow one into the other, and that starts at Miriam's Corner during that retreat. And as the regulars are rounding the bend there, like Jim said, there's a road that connects there heading towards the town of Bedford. And that is really going to be the story of the rest of this battle, where tertiary roads will feed militia soldiers into the fight. Also, where those tertiary roads will engage with the main road, and also where the main road crosses bodies of water, streams, rivers, whatever that is that has a bridge over top of it, because those bridges become natural choke points. So at Miriam's Corner, that is exactly what we have going on. We have a tertiary road that's feeding into the Bay Road, and just beyond that is a small bridge that crosses over a stream. So if you look at the account of militia volunteer Reverend Edmund Foster from the town of Reading, who was on the north side of the British column, they're encroaching on the Bay Road. As Jim said, they could see the regulars at a distance. Foster said, "We discovered the enemy's flank guard of about 80 to 100 men who on their retreat from Concord kept the height of land, the main body, and the road. The British troops and the Americans at that time were equally distanced from Miriam's Corner, about 20 rods short of that place. The Americans made a halt. The British marched down the hill with very slow but steady step, without music and a word being spoken that could be heard. Silence reigned on both sides." We expect, or we estimate, I should say, that there are probably about 1,000 militia soldiers that will engage in the vicinity of Miriam's Corner. So that is soldiers from Reading. We have some of the men from the North Bridge that have flown in and around the town and around the ridges on the outside of town. Some of them are even getting there before the regulars start their retreat because they know that is the route they're going to have to take. And as that silence is reigning, as the British column crosses over that small stream there at Miriam's Corner, eventually it comes to their rear guard. And according to Foster, is at that point that the rear guard of the British regulars turned around and fired upon the militia. However, if you read many of the other accounts, it says almost the exact opposite thing, is that as the British rear guard is crossing over that stream, the militia will begin firing. Here, they will start an attack that will last for 8 hours following this. And it's at this point that Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith would write later, on our leaving Concord to return to Boston, they began to fire on us from behind walls, ditches, trees, and etc., which we marched through and increased to a very great degree and continued without intermission of 5 minutes altogether for, I believe, upwards of 18 miles. So that I can't think, but it must have been a preconceived scheme in them to attack the king's troops the first favorable opportunity that offered. Otherwise, I think they could not, in so short a time from our marching out, have raised such a numerous body and for so great a space of ground. He's kind of leading into that idea. The militia know what they're doing. They have been preparing for this, not just in the supplies and the training, but they also generally know what they're doing as military forces, right? And this gets down to, as the fighting begins in the afternoon of April 19th, kind of that myth, right, of British soldiers marching in the road, they don't know what they're doing. Militia soldiers who are hiding behind the trees, and they're jumping out, and they're shooting at British soldiers who are just marching without thinking, right? And to a certain extent, maybe a little bit of truth to that, in that the militia are using the terrain to their natural advantage, and we'll see that throughout the course of the battle. However, there's a certain level of organization to it. Many of the militia soldiers that day, including Edmund Foster from Reading, would say that the rest of the fight was carried on with little to no military discipline. So you're not really going to see in the rest of this engagement where you have battalion fronts that are forming in certain sections of the battlefield, where you have lines that are squaring off against each other, because the objective of the British Army is to escape, to get out. They want to continue moving as quickly as they can, which is going to result in the militia adapting their tactics as necessary to engage the column as they're going down the road. So from Miriam's Corner, as those Reading companies start engaging the rear of the British column, they're going to continue pursuing in small clumps, small bands of men. Edmund Foster would talk about how after engaging in Miriam's Corner, they saw a wood at a distance, that many of their men leapt over the wall and made for that wood, knowing that that would lay on the road near where the British would eventually march, right? So Reading is going to start flanking the British column, moving to another advantageous position down the road. Meanwhile, the regulars, the head of the column, a third of a mile in front of them, are going to be encroaching on another hill rise called Brooks Hill. And it's there are more militia soldiers. Militia soldiers we've already encountered today. The Woburn companies that had arrived in Lexington just after the engagement on the Lexington Green. They had started marching in pursuit of the British regulars when eventually they ended up scooping up a British grenadier who had stopped and dropped out of the column from exhaustion. He becomes the first prisoner of war that day, and they scoop him up and they realize, if we continue marching up this road, we're going to run straight into the backside of the British column, and this is all before the fight at the bridge. So Woburn decides to detour. They go south. They go south through the town of Lincoln, and they will take tertiary roads that will eventually lead them back to the main Bay Road. And they arrive at this place called Brooks Hill, and it's there they will be, quote, pitching and refreshing themselves, waiting for what's going to happen next. And Major Loamy Baldwin from the town of Woburn will talk about how soon he saw some of his men and some others running off the side of the hill nearby with reports that the regulars were marching. And it's at this point, Baldwin takes his 180 men and he forms them up, and they decide, we're not going to make our stand here at Brooks Hill necessarily. We're going to retreat a little ways down the road and find a more advantageous position. So as they're withdrawing, the fighting at Miriam's Corner begins. And as the British column continues advancing on Brooks Hill, more militia soldiers, now probably from Chelmsford, Sudbury, Reading, all these other towns are now starting to arrive on the north and the south side of the road. You have companies from Framingham that are probably coming into this section of the fight. But what it does is it kind of creates this pocket of musketry that is happening all around the British column as they're moving down the road. And as this is going on, those flankers that Jim talked about are going to have to deploy, go out, cross over a stone wall, chase militia soldiers away, go back towards the column, then deploy again, go out, chase militia soldiers away. It's an exhausting experience. And only within the first mile and a half, they're already being fired upon from all directions. And by the time they get to Brooks Hill, they're going to discover again more militia soldiers being fed into the action there. The fighting is going to continue to grow. And eventually, the column is going to cross over what we refer to as Brooks Plateau, is a tall rise of ground where they can probably see miles in all directions. And every road is swarming with militia soldiers that are moving towards them. And it's an even greater incentive to keep moving, going down the road. Here, the British will then start to descend into a valley we call Elm Brook today. And as they descend into that valley, they're going to have to cross over, you guessed it, another bridge. Because the Elm Brook stretch that runs through there is kind of a swampy marshland today, but it was also ditched and drained in 1775 as farmland. They were using this to grow hay for their cattle. So a lot of these areas are swampy, they're marshy, but they're still passable to a certain extent. And as the British column is heading down into Elm Brook and they start to come up the other side, they also know at the top of that hill, the road that they are on is going to take a sharp turn, a sharp 90-degree angle running north. And it's going to go north for a couple hundred yards, and then it's going to take another sharp 90-degree angle running back towards the east. So it creates this very tight S-bend in the road, which is going to be advantageous for militia soldiers who are going to take advantage of those corners. Particularly Reading and those other men that had flanked around from Miriam's Corner. They're going to start getting themselves into position on the north side of what we refer to as the Bloody Angle or Elmbrook Hill. But at the same time, you have the Woburn men who had retreated from Brooks Hill, and they set themselves up in an orchard just at the top of that south bend. And by the time the lead of the British column starts to come up that road, it's probably too late for them to realize what's going to happen next, because they're going to get hit square in the face by those Woburn men who will open fire at very close distance. One of the men said they were about 55 yards from the enemy when they opened fire, and he said he fired multiple times diagonally through the British column from that distance. And British column probably sends out flankers to dislodge them. The Woburn men will withdraw to another hill rise just behind them, but the column has to continue rounding that bend. And as they're rounding the bend, they're also being pursued by thousands of militia in the back. Some of the same men that had engaged at Miriam's Corner, some of the same men that had just come into the fight at Brooks Hill, and those numbers are continuing to grow throughout the course of this battle. Many of those militia soldiers, as they fall to the rear of the British column, are just going to be pursuing with a constant hail of musketry poured into the British rear guard. And that's going to be where the majority of the casualties are sustained on April 19th, as those men are trying to fight back those militiamen. As they cross over, the rear of the British column crosses over Elm Brook, over that bridge, they're now being fired upon by militia soldiers who have the high ground. And then those militia soldiers are going to pursue across the river, or across the bridge, and they're going to follow the militia, the regulars, up and around the first bend. Meanwhile, the head of the British column is now rounding the north bend of the Bloody Angle, or Elmbrook Hill, and there they're meeting Reading again. And they're meeting Lincoln, and they're meeting other companies that had flanked around, and it's just going to create this rolling fire all the way down both sides of the British column, and at the rear and at the front. But it's also in this stretch of land today where Hartwell Tavern is within the bounds of our park. It's kind of the center, the heart of our park in every essence, where we do our Battle Road scenario. It is Elmbrook Hill through Hartwell Tavern, where this stretch of land is where the militia are going to start discovering the danger that is engaging this British column, and the danger that is getting too close to the British column, and finding out what happens when the flankers get behind you. Because it's there somewhere around the Hartwell barns or the Mason family that live next door that some of the militia soldiers will encroach up behind the barn. They're firing around the sides of the building into the British regulars, and they get caught by flankers behind them. One of the captains from the town of Bedford is killed in this small engagement that's there, and some of the other men from that town are also mortally wounded or severely wounded in this engagement. But that's going to be a lesson that's going to be repeated over and over again throughout the course of the day is do not get too close to the British column because those flankers will scoop you up very quickly. But still, the regulars are going to keep plowing through. They're just trying to get through this space as quickly as they can. But again, when you have a column that stretches a third of a mile in length, and you have all these additional chaises and vehicles that they're heaping wounded men onto, they're taking horses from the local population, that column is going to continue to grow throughout the course of the day. So they'll keep plowing through the Hartwell area. They'll keep plowing around what is the home of Captain William Smith from the town of Lincoln, depositing dead and wounded men the entire way because they don't really have the option of scooping up these men and taking them with them. For the most part, if you fall behind, you're left behind in this section of the battle. And those men mostly are going to be cared for by the militia and by the families that live nearby. Supposedly one of the British grenadiers mortally wounded near the Smith house will be cared for by Smith's family after this fighting occurs. And when he dies, they bury him across the street from where the house is. So many of these British soldiers, after being captured or being wounded, will discover that there's not necessarily, they're taking no quarter is not true. But the men who are in the column absolutely think that is the case, which is going to increase the severity and the desperation to get out of this situation. So as the British column continues plodding down the battle road, again being hit on both sides, this rolling tunnel of fire chasing them down the road, eventually they'll get into the vicinity of a field where it just so happens a few hours earlier, our midnight rider, Paul Revere, had been captured. Right? So we know Paul Revere gets to Lexington, but a big portion of that story that most people don't know is that Paul Revere never makes it to Concord because he was captured by some of those British officers that had been sent out to scoop up some of these men. Paul Revere had been let go by those British officers early in the evening, so he is long gone at this point. But the British soldiers will come rolling through those pasture fields. They'll pass that area, pursued now by thousands of militia soldiers at their rear, firing into them, but they get a little bit of a break, because the terrain on both sides of the roads has wetlands. One of those areas is now Hanscom Air Force Base today, had an extensive wetland area, so it's probably causing the militia to go out and around it. And then the British soldiers will curve down the road that we call today Nelson Farmland. It's right at the edge of our Minuteman Visitor Center parking lot, and they will enter a space that we refer to as Parker's Revenge. And as these British soldiers are plowing down the road, the militia will again reappear at the rear of the British column, driving them hard down the road, constant gunfire. And for the most part, at this point in the fight, the militia will no longer appear in the front of the British column until the regulars have gotten back to Lexington a few miles away. At this point, the British are also starting to have expended most of their ammunition. They came out into this fight with about 36 rounds per man, and some of their men will later relate most of it had been shot away by the time they get within a mile to 2 miles of Lexington. However, they will discover one other militia company in their path, directly in their front. And I'm going to let Jim cover this section of the fight.
Thanks. So, so what's happening now, they're crossing from Lincoln into Lexington. And right at the border between Lincoln and Lexington, there's a brook and a bridge. And beyond the bridge, high ground that was wooded because it was, it's a sloping ground, a lot of boulders. It doesn't yield itself very well to the plow. So those areas usually became woodlots. So you get this high ground overlooking a choke point with good cover and concealment. It covers the bridge. It covers the road. And that's where the Lexington militia went back into the fight in the afternoon. And that's part of the story that is one of my favorite parts of the story. We know what happens to the company in the morning when they get shot to pieces. But Parker was able to bring them back together and take at least a part of that company back into the fight. And for a long time, we didn't know where that happened. We had one account from Nathan Monroe writing 50 years after the fact, and he said, "We met the regulars in the bounds of Lincoln. We fired on them and continued to do so till they met their reinforcement in Lexington." So, that's not a lot to go on. And so there's a lot of speculation. And then there's, of course, this rocky outcrop very near the road and the bridge that we, for a long time, thought was the site of the battle. From, again, taking officers out there on staff rides, a lot of the younger officers would look at that piece of ground and say, "Oh, this is great, perfect ambush site, and set your 30 cals up here, you know. But I remember some older officers going like, well, this is a death trap because the position is easily outflanked. And, you know, even if you kept the flanking parties, even if you kept their heads down with fire, you're going to all of a sudden have the head of the column come up and you're trapped. There's no way off of that hill. So there was a lot of doubts. And so many years ago, our cooperating association, the Friends of Minuteman, funded an archaeological investigation, and they found the battle site. You could see two clear, well-defined positions. On the elevated ground amongst the boulders and the trees, they found a lot of fired musket balls, all of standard military size, between 0.67, 0.68 inches. And then in the lowland just off of the road, there was a linear cluster of musket balls, all fired mixed caliber, because the militia are carrying, older military arms, French arms, Dutch and Spanish arms. They're carrying a lot of fowling guns. So clearly fired from the militia against what we think is the vanguard, sending their men across that bridge and then wheeling to the left and extending out, and then an exchange of fire. And what's interesting, they found 32 musket balls. 31 were confirmed as having been fired, and there's one that's questionable. But the fact that they didn't find any definitive, unfired rounds dropped, that suggests you're not seeing reloading. So probably each side fired once, and then Lexington withdrew. And, the flankers probably held that key position and then rejoined. There's a great account from Captain Souter in the Marine Company, Line Infantry Company of the Marines, and he said, on the retreat back, he said, first we took possession of one hill and then another, and in that way made their way back towards Boston. So, yes, you've got flankers out providing security, but they're also identifying key pieces of ground and taking them and holding them to keep the column moving. And so we see, again, archaeological evidence of exactly that happening. Key terrain, we have to have it. It's held by the enemy. Go get them. But as Jared mentioned, quickly after that, the wheels are coming off the cart. Discipline is breaking down. Officers are down. Companies are being led by corporals and sergeants, if they're lucky. And it's really the men are starting to run. As one account said, they began to run instead of retreat in order. And at one point, two officers have to get in front of their men and present their bayonets to them, and their fusees. And it said, they only then did the men stop and form under a very heavy fire. So things are getting really, really bad, but hope is on the way. Jared?
Yes. So I'll also just put in here for Battle Road purposes, right? So the other half of our Battle Road scenarios that we'll do on April 19th, 2025 is Parker's Revenge. And it's wild to be able to do a tactical demonstration literally exactly where we know those men were standing at. And that's part of what kind of makes a lot of our events that we have in this park special, is because we know so much about, these guys were here. And we can show how they tactically use the landscape, which is very cool. But where Jim left off, right, Parker's company has withdrawn. They're going to continue flanking. But the British column still being pursued by thousands of militia soldiers at the back, who are advancing, firing, falling back, more men advancing, firing, falling back, and they're going to keep driving the column forward until they get to a large rise of ground, today referred to as the bluff, just on the other side of our battlefield. And it's there that the British, for the first time, will actually try to hold a section of ground against this throng of militia that are approaching them. And that's because for the first time, they're going to discover a section of high ground that there are no militia on top of as of yet. So as the accounts go, they send a party of men, flankers, up onto that hill to try and hold this ground, which will allow the column to pass quickly around the base of the hill and go up over another taller hill behind, referred to as Fisk's Hill. But Edmund Foster, who was in that Reading company that engaged at Miriam's Corner, is still pursuing the British column, right? And he will say as they get on the area of the bluff, he said, a man rode up on horseback, one of their own, unarmed. The enemy were then pressing around the hill just below the tavern. They had posted a small body of their troops on the north side of the hill, which fired upon us. The horse and his rider fell instantly to the ground. The horse died immediately, but the man received no injury. We were quick at the spot from which we returned fire. So very briefly, this kind of firefight breaks out between these forces, but the British, because they're trying to move, are going to have to withdraw from that ground very quickly. And as they withdraw, they're now going down into another depression of ground, another kind of shooting points, you might say, for the militia, who will get on top of the bluff and they can fire down into the British column, now retreating up what is called Fisk's Hill. And it's from there, again, the regulars will try to mount a rear guard to protect the column going up and over the hill. And it's here, Foster said, an officer mounted on an elegant horse with his sword drawn in his hand was riding backwards and forwards, commanding and urging on the British troops. A number of Americans behind a pile of rails raised their guns and fired with deadly effect. The officer fell, and the horse took fright, leaped the wall, and ran directly towards those who had killed his rider. The enemy discharged their musketry in that direction, but their fire took no effect. And the reason I read this is because this kind of gets into the mindset of who these militia soldiers are. Because that horse, as soon as it got into amongst their ranks, they do the first thing that soldiers are going to do on the battlefield. They start going through all the stuff that's in the horse's saddlebags, right? They're pulling out pistols, they're pulling out documents, and they had convinced themselves that they had killed that Marine officer that they all disliked, Pitcairn, right? In reality, no, they had not. Pitcairn would not meet his demise until the Battle of Bunker Hill in June, right? But they thought that they had gotten him in that moment, and Lexington still proudly displays that pair of pistols that they had pulled out of this horse's riding bags, right? It's more likely it was probably an officer from the 38th Regiment of Foot, but still, they're showing that they are in pursuit, they're keeping track on what they're doing, right? This isn't just a rabble of men who are necessarily just running around doing everything that they want. They are tactically thinking about this, and even so much so that they're looking at who are we attacking? Who are we getting? Who are we taking these things from? And that's going to persist down into the town of Lexington, because this last hill that the regulars have to cross going into the town of Lexington, as we said, they shot away most of their ammunition. They are exhausted. They know they still have 12 miles to go back to Boston, and this fighting has been continuous, and the number of militia just continued to grow throughout the course of that morning and afternoon. Things are looking pretty bleak, and it's at this point, as Jim said, the wheels start to come off the cart. There's disorganization. The officers are having a difficult time controlling their men, and it's not until they reach this last hill, referred to as Concord Hill, going into Lexington, that it completely dissolves. And it dissolves because those militia soldiers can now, or those regulars can now look out 2 miles in the distance on the other side of the town of Lexington. And coming down that road, they see a wall of scarlet and red coming to retrieve them. That is Percy's relief column marching out of the town of Boston. And as Jim said earlier, they had gotten delayed on their starts. They didn't start marching until 7, 8 a.m. in the morning. So they are well behind schedule. Percy has the 1st Brigade. These are mostly battalion companies that had not gone out in Smith's original column, but he also has 2 6-pounder light field artillery pieces. So as Percy starts to arrive, Smith's column breaks, and those men are going to start sprinting down through the town of Lexington, whatever they can do to get behind their own men's lines. Percy will draw up on the other side of the town of Lexington using the small rises of ground that are there. He'll plant his artillery pieces on both sides of the road, and then he'll start using that artillery for what artillery is meant to be used for, is to keep the militia back, right? They're keeping the enemy at a distance. So they're not necessarily going to be striking militia soldiers with these artillery rounds, but it's enough to keep them away from Smith's column as they're getting behind Percy's line. And Loami Baldwin, that militia officer from Woburn who had been in it from the morning, he'll actually recount following the British through downtown Lexington when suddenly the guns began to play upon them. He said the first ball came flying in amongst the midst of some of the militia men who were in the middle of the road pursuing, and it scattered them. So Baldwin goes running behind him. He gets behind the meeting house in downtown Lexington, and he said the next ball came flying out the side of the building beside his head. And at that point, they know, yeah, we should probably back off just a little bit. And he said he retired to a field just behind where he laid and watched and listened to the balls flying and abounding through the ground in the field. But this gives the regulars a reprieve. It gives them a little bit of time to catch their breath. Now they have additional reinforcements. They have about 1,000 additional reinforcements. So the number has gone up to about 1,800 regulars with 2 6-pounder guns. And they're also going to take this time, take stock of their losses and take care of some of their wounded. And it's during this time that the battle is going to transition, because now the British soldiers are also going to start their destruction of the countryside. They're going to start burning houses in Lexington. They're going to burn 3 houses on the outskirts of the town, as they're also going to start going through the buildings. And after about 30 minutes or so, Percy knows we cannot stay here. We need to get back to Boston, so they start the retreat. And as they do so, now even more militia soldiers are starting to arrive. But now the landscape turns from more rural landscape to urban landscape. As you get closer back to the city of Boston, the density of the homes along the Bay Road is going to continue to skyrocket until it is truly urban landscape. And as Percy's relief force is moving down the road, they're again going to be encased by a rolling fire on all sides of the column. They're continuing to pursue, but still keeping a bit of a distance, right? Because they know if we get too close, we're going to get scooped up by those flankers. But the flankers are going to become less effective as they get in amongst the buildings in the towns. And as they get back into an area that we call Arlington today, it was a town called Monotony in the time period. That is where the heaviest, the most devastating, the most brutal fighting of the entire day is going to occur. Because there, it truly transitions into urban combat. There, the militia are able to get into the houses. They're firing out of the windows of the buildings, from around the sides of the houses. Companies from places like Danvers, from the northern section of the city of Boston, are starting to arrive, right? Some of these men will actually get into the front yard of a house from a man named Jason Russell in Monotony, where they're firing down the road at the British column coming towards them, again, not paying attention to the flankers that are moving around behind them. And for many of these militia soldiers at the Jason Russell house, what they'll end up doing is running into the house itself, thinking that the regulars might not necessarily follow them inside, and they were sorely mistaken. Because now the British soldiers are having to fight street by street, house by house, room by room. And at the Jason Russell house, that becomes very apparent, because those flankers that follow in those men into that house, some of the militia will go downstairs into the basement. They'll close the door behind them. Some of them will go upstairs, and the British soldiers follow in pursuit. And it results in some nasty, bloody hand-to-hand combat inside the house, where they're firing through doors in the house. The militiamen who go into the basement survive. The ones who go upstairs do not. And it's from that basement position that those men are going to have to sit there for the next 20 to 30 minutes listening to those British soldiers going through the house above them, and the fighting raging all throughout the homes in these buildings. People now who are not even directly engaged in the battle are also being injured or killed. There are a few men in a local tavern that are supposedly there drinking throughout the course of the day. British soldiers burst in, those men are killed. Civilians are now fleeing. This huge refugee crisis is now unfolding across the entire landscape, because all of these towns, these people who live there, are fleeing in all directions to get away from the fighting as it comes back into the city of Boston. And as they get closer to what is Cambridge, Percy also has another idea in his mind, and that is they might be cut off in the town of Cambridge, because there was a large bridge that crosses over the Charles River from Cambridge that leads to the Boston Neck that will get them back to the city of Boston. On the way out that morning, Percy and his men had discovered that the bridge, the planks, had been pulled up. Now, fortunately for Percy's men, the planks had been stacked next to the side of the bridge. They were able to reconnect the planks and cross over, but Percy is also expecting now on the retreat, they probably pulled up the bridge again, and this time it probably won't be as easy as restacking the planks on the bridge, right? So he decides in a split second to make a decision that will ultimately end up saving the British column. That he's not going to take the route back into Boston proper. He's going to detour the British column to the north, and he's going to take them into the town of Charlestown, where Bunker Hill is today. And it's there that Percy's men, when they detour to the north, kind of throws the militia off kilter, right? They have set up actually barricades at a place called Watson's Corner down closer to where Somerville is. And from those barricades, they're fighting, but again, they get caught by light infantry soldiers. The artillery, every so often, are going to drop trail in the middle of the road and start sending round ball down the center of the road, trying to disperse the militia. But it's becoming more and more difficult with that urban setting. And as Percy's column veers to the north, there's also going to be one last opportunity for the militia to truly cut them off and destroy that column, and that is about 800 men commanded by one Timothy Pickering from the town of Salem that are marching from Salem down into the fight. And unfortunately, Pickering's men are just a little too late, and they arrive on the hillside to be watching the British column slipping over and across what is the Charlestown Neck. Today there's a giant rotary there leading into where Bunker Hill is today, and it's there that the fighting is ultimately going to come to a conclusion, because the British column at about sunset that day will slip across the neck, pursued by these thousands of militia soldiers. One man from a distance talked about the sight of the muzzle flashes illuminating the ground around them as they're retreating over and across the neck, and then ultimately up onto Bunker Hill, because they know that they have now gotten under the safety of the artillery from their warships that have been pulled up the Charles River and around the Charlestown Peninsula, that they can cover them. So the fighting that day will come to a conclusion about 8 p.m. that evening as the British soldiers cross the neck. The last person to be killed on that retreat across the neck is a 14-year-old boy who lived in a house just at the base of the neck. He put his head out the window, and the British soldiers, not knowing who he was, ended up shooting him as they retreated across the neck. But there, the fighting will come to a conclusion. By the end of the day now, 273 British soldiers have been killed, wounded, or captured in this engagement. About 95 provincials the same. However, the thing about that is if you look at the statistics of wounded to killed, the militia is about 50-50. 49 militia soldiers have been killed in action. And we often attribute that to how intense the fighting is in places like Menotomy and these other urban settings where it is truly up close, hand-to-hand, personal combat. So as the fighting kind of wraps down that evening, the British also again have another problem. They're across the Charles River from the city of Boston, and they have to get those men back. So in a truly 18th century Dunkirk-esque style, they will end up taking ships and boats and other naval craft that they can find from the outskirts of the city of Boston, sending them across to Charlestown with relief forces that will set up and start entrenching the city of Charlestown on what is Bunker Hill. And then they will start evacuating all of Percy and Smith's men back to the city of Boston for the next night and the next morning. And there they will take stock of their losses and start to settle in, because over the next few days, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of militia soldiers will start to arrive and besiege the city of Boston. Now the British soldiers are stuck. There is no way in or out, and this siege will last for another 11 months following this fight. So this is just the first day of what then becomes an 11-month siege and an 8-year war.
And, it's interesting. Gage writes a letter. I can't remember if it's to Barrington or Dartmouth, a couple days after this. And of course, these are the same people who have been telling him, no, it's not a problem. It's just a noisy faction. Show some strength. You're not getting any more troops. You don't need them. And he basically just writes the town is now completely invested by, nearly 20,000 men that have appeared in very short time. And now they're bringing up artillery. It's a classic thanks for nothing. And he's stuck. And there's also another story that I love to tell. Ensign Jeremy Lister, who's a young officer. He was 22 years old. He'd been in the Army since he was 17. Got his commission from his father on Christmas Day and was promptly sent to Canada to join his regiment. And then that regiment, the 10th, was transferred to Boston in the fall of 1774. Or summer of 1774. So this was his first combat mission. He went out as a volunteer because he was in a battalion company, but one of the officers in the light company of the regiment was ill and wasn't going out, and so he said he thought it was a disgrace for the regiment to go out on its first expedition without its full complement of officers. And so he goes, and of course for his trouble, he's wounded at Miriam's Corner, where this whole thing began. Got hit in the right elbow joint. He said that the ball basically smashed through and lodged just under the skin. And as he said, effectually disabling that arm. And of course, as he gets back into Lexington, they meet Percy's relief column with the 1st Brigade. And of course, they get a rest. There's a surgeon with the relief column who sees to his arm. He says, at this point, after, marching, many miles and many hours, lack of food and loss of blood, I'd begun to grow a bit faint. Classic British understatement. And he finally, when he crosses over into Charlestown and he's ferried back among the first of those evacuated, and he returns to the home that he was billeted in with a family who were friends to government. And of course, they see this young man coming in through the door, and he's badly wounded and pale, and so the lady of the house insists that he goes to bed, and he says, "No, ma'am, I would like a dish of tea." And she said, "You're lightheaded, you must go to bed." And he says, "No, I would like a dish of tea," which was soon brought. The imagination may conceive, but the English language could hardly describe the satisfaction I derived from the taking of that tea, notwithstanding I was interrupted by 1,000 questions. You can just feel the relief in that statement that he was alive. Of course, his career was ruined. His arm never recovered, though he kept it. And he was sent back to England for recruiting. So join the British Army. It's a wonderful opportunity.
Just to kind of, I have a couple qualitative questions, and we should probably think about wrapping up here. Jared, you mentioned how the British are carrying about 36 rounds, at least the flank companies, on the initial expedition. Do we have any sense of the average ammunition issue on
I believe it's about the
provincial
same, from my understanding. Jim, would you agree with that?
Yeah, the laws state that you have to have 20 bullets sized to fit your gun and a pound of powder. The extant cartridge pouches that we have fit 19 to 20 cartridges. That's not to say men didn't carry more in their packs or in their pockets. But yeah, about 20 to 30 seems to be pretty average.
And are there any, obviously it's a running gunfight for many of these town companies as well. Did any American descriptions recall, running out of ammunition, or is it maybe less intense for them than the sort of 8-hour-long gunfight the British are engaged in?
Yeah, the funny thing is, of course, some of the Americans must have run out of ammunition, but for them, they're moving as much as they're firing, because they're going to fire, run, and take up the next spot. They've got this great advantage where they know where the enemy is, where he's going, and how he's going to get there, so they can kind of conserve things, whereas the Crown forces are just stuck in the middle of this gauntlet of fire constantly. So, and also if a militiaman runs out of ammunition, he just kind of falls to the rear and follows along and hopes for resupply when he gets into Cambridge. So yeah, there's really no accounts of running out of ammunition because it's not as big a deal for them.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that one of the things that we often like to throw out when people say it's a series of small skirmishes, and not referring to this as a major engagement, a battle itself, is that when you look at the ammunition expenditures that we hypothesize, right? So if we're conservative on the estimates of British regulars in Smith's column, right, from Miriam's Corner to Lexington, if they've shot away 36 rounds of ammunition or so, that's 25,000 rounds of ammunition shot away within 5.5 miles of fighting. And even when you look at the militia that day, because in total the militia will have about 4,000 men engaged in combat that day, and if we're incredibly conservative about the ammunition that they're expending, when we say 10 rounds per man, you're looking at 40,000 rounds within that, right? This is a lot of ammunition that's being expended between both sides, and that's just hypotheticals.
I often, when I lecture on the Revolutionary War to my undergraduate students, will say the fight at Freeman's Farm was kind of the longest stand-up gunfight of the war, and it sounds like maybe I need to reconsider that a little bit here. Any questions, Lee or Andrew, that you have for these guys?
I've got one, kind of on a public history standpoint. So obviously, as park rangers, you guys interact with the public a huge amount. And you alluded to a little bit, some people come to Minuteman, I'm sure, with a lot of thoughts and feelings about this iconic American moment. What happens when you encounter those thoughts and feelings that are a little different than fact? What's your reaction to that?
So one of the things that, as interpreters, we're trained, we're taught, meet the visitors where they are. So if they say, well, the Americans had rifles and they shot from long distance and the British didn't know how to counter it, I had a group of people who were really into that idea, that marksmanship was what won the American Revolution. And I said, well, okay, both sides did practice marksmanship, including the British. There were no rifles that were carried here at Lexington and Concord, though they do come in during the siege of Boston. So I offer at least a little bit of validation to their point of view, because if you just come out and say, no, you're wrong, walls come down, you're done. So you have to, it's very delicate, and then say, okay, marksmanship certainly played a role, but let's talk about organization. Let's talk about training and preparedness. Let's talk about supplies, logistics, those other aspects of warfighting that may not be as romantic, but are just as vital. And just try to expand their view a little bit. You learn over time, what's going to be received, and how to make sure that they're going to stay open to what you're sharing with them.
Yeah. One of the things that I've discovered since being here, first of all, the towns around us are so immersed in the history of their towns, right? And sometimes that's for better and sometimes that's for worse, right? Because you have all these stories that have been told from generation to generation to generation. So it's always a little bit of tiptoeing around when we talk about different aspects of the battle and who was where and who was what. And our thing is always trying to stick to the facts that we know that we have, right? The documentation we have. And oftentimes that results in reframing things, of finding new stuff and then having to retell the story in different ways, because we found the Parker's Revenge battle site and we can tell you where that fight happened now, things along those lines. So the cool thing about being in public history and also working in the National Park Service site that is so supported by the communities around us is that as we continue doing that research, we're always refining what we know about this battle, and we're getting deeper and deeper and deeper and closer to what may have actually happened, while also acknowledging we don't know, right? And for the general public that come to our sites, maybe not from the town surrounding, I also discovered that most of them have an idea of Lexington and Concord. However, the vast majority of people have no idea what happened after the Green and after the North Bridge. So for many of the people who come and they ask questions about these things, it's more of an enlightening, like, oh, wow moment, because they had no idea the second half of this battle really occurred. And I think that really speaks volumes to what we focused on teaching American students between the 19th and the 20th century, right?
So obviously you all have a mountain of preparations for between now and April 19th, 2025. How are you all holding up? What is it going to? Are you? Let me sort of center my thoughts here. Are you all optimistic? Do you think about the outcome of the reenactment?
It's going to be successful because not only us, but the reenactors, our volunteers, our partners, everybody wants this to be a success. The thing that I've noticed about Battle Road, running it for as long as I have, is that, our community, our partners are invested in this. The reenactors look forward to this. One of them refers to it as History Christmas. It is the date on their calendar. And, we put in a lot of effort, obviously, in addition to the registration. Of course, now I've got the registration numbers. I turn those over to Jared, who's, making tactical demonstration maps and, kind of putting his wargaming skills into action here. But we also have to make ammunition. We're a little bit over halfway to what we need, and we're over 10,000 rounds right now. But everybody, if we put in a lot of effort, our volunteers are also putting in a lot of effort. Just yesterday, Jared and I were at an event in Lexington where the reenactors, headed by the Lexington Minutemen, wanted to recreate a Middlesex regimental muster. Regimental musters are relatively rare, but you started to see them happening more often. And so they had several companies. Now, when we say a regiment, we're talking about, in terms of reenacting, we're talking about maybe 75 guys, but still, it was an impressive number. And they were out there in a car park in chilly weather, for about 4 hours, going through all of the maneuvers from the 1764 manual exercise, and then practicing some tactics specific for Battle Road that Jared's been working on. We had our civilian demonstrators out there as well, and talking with visitors. I mean, we didn't start that. We went and supported them, helped with some of the safety briefings and some of the tactics, but they wanted to do it. And so that's something that always makes me feel good and optimistic because of the amount of effort that everybody's putting in.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. It's been incredible to have you on, and we're all kind of with you in spirit and excited for this thing to come off in April.
Thanks for having us. Really appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend and leave us a review. It really helps and we'd love to hear your thoughts. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford, produced by Lee Cugino. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.